Hello, I'm Josh, and this is for the productive and counterproductive behaviors in the workplace assignment. So I'm just going to get right into it. So the first question is, how have recent historical events affected the course of research in organizational psychology? And then give an example. So I believe, and I think that this is probably the example that we would all agree to. And I think it's important to use it because it's the most obvious, and that is COVID. COVID has severely affected the course of everything, and it's not just research, though obviously research has played a huge role in it, or has been like wildly affected by COVID. If you go on PubMed, if you go on PsycNet or Google Scholar, Liberty's Library, Jerry Falwell, and you're just searching for any kind of research, pretty much anything that you look for is going to, in some way or another, be tied to COVID now. I feel like that's what I have seen most often when it comes to research and something that has affected it, and especially IO research, because it's now everything. Like anything you type in that's an IO term, such as empathy, it'll be empathy after the pandemic, or working remotely. That's a huge example of something that wasn't even really being researched that much. I mean, I'm sure it was to some capacity, but now it's being researched like crazy because that's a huge thing that we now are facing in the IO field, is that we need to know how to lead our employees who work remotely, whereas there might have only been a few people or very distinct areas in which people were working remotely. And so, because of the pandemic, that has affected research in that way, is that other different topics, because the world has changed due to that event. And so, as ridiculous as it might sound to say, it goes without saying. The world was changed by COVID, and, the least of these was our IO research. All right, the next question we're going to dive into from Chapter 3. Describe the socialization process for the graduate students in your program. So my program is the IO Psychology Masters. It's residential. And is the program successful in socializing newcomers and created a job embeddedness? So I'm going to describe my experience because I think that that's the best thing that I can do. And then I will answer at the end how I think that they did. And, you can draw your own conclusions as I'm going. So, my experience in the socialization process for the IO program was a bit chaotic. And what I mean by this is that in part it's probably my fault. I applied and got accepted into the program and registered the week before classes started in fall 2022. And so, in part, I believe that there wasn't any time to be socialized into the program. And that's on me. That's my fault. I didn't even know that I was going to be coming to graduate school. But I do believe that once I got into the program, you would think after I started, that would be when socialization began. That there would be like, hey, like do this, do this, do this. And there, I don't know. There was one event that we had where all the students in the program came together, and one of the professors discussed the expectations and the goals for the program. I don't think that any of those goals or stated objectives were ever, nobody was really ever included in those things. None of those things ever came to fruition. And then furthermore, beyond that, there was just not, it was just kind of chaos. It was kind of, the program was in flux. It was changing from, I believe, like the Psych course tag to MSPS course tag. And so everything was in flux. The classes were changing. Everything was kind of all over the map. And so I realized that, the professors were saying, hey, come get involved in research. I didn't know what research was. I had a computer science undergrad, so I came from a different background than many of the people did into the program. And so I think that that's a main problem that I have seen and had with the program, is that if, it's essentially like, hey, you're like me, come in here and do this. But then when somebody like myself, I did not have that background. I didn't have the opportunity to come in and say, oh, yes, of course, I know what research is. I had no idea at the time. And I've learned and I know now, but at the time there was no way for me as a first year student to take place in being socialized through joining someone else's research project or thesis because I didn't even understand what a thesis was. So I believe that, I became socialized because I am a deeply personal and social person, um, and I love people. So I wanted to get connected with everybody, and I think that you do see that in certain situations in the workforce. You have an employee who just comes in and they're just right there connected. They're locked in with everybody. They become just a normal part of the workplace, and that could be due in part just to maybe their own, I guess, maybe optimism or just social skills on their own, but not everybody has that. You can't rely on that for people to become connected in that way, socialized in that way, because they're essentially socializing themselves at that point. So all that to say, I'll allow you to draw your own conclusions about my experience, but for me, I do not believe that I was socialized well at all into the program. And I do think that I probably would have dropped out if I did not just make friends with a couple people right off the bat due to my own social skills. And if I hadn't done that, I very well may have dropped out of the program because I never really felt connected to it. And I'm not sure if maybe I missed the bus or whatever it was, but yeah, I never really felt that level of socialization take place for myself. All right, the next question. How can how can an organization reduce or prevent work-family conflict? This one's important. This one's super important, and I know this from my own work experience, from people that I have managed, or in my own experience when I have been managed, is that work-family conflict, it always happens. There will always be work-family conflict because we all are people. We have families. We have personal things outside of the job, of course, because no one's a robot. And maybe every now and again, maybe you have an orphan with no friends who comes and works at your company, but I've never heard of anybody like that before. Everybody has somebody and something that's important to them outside of the job. And so I just, reading through the textbook, there's a few examples that were given about how to try to address work-family conflict and how to reduce it, avoid it, maybe not avoid it, because if you're avoiding it, it's still happening, but to reduce it or prevent it. But the main one that really spoke to me that I really felt would be most meaningful to me personally, and then that I have also implemented in my own job, is just being being a real person. So an example that I had thought of was if you have an employee, she needs to pick up her child at 3:30 from school twice a week. Her shift ends at 4. What are you going to do? The reality is that you can be steadfast in this rule. You can say, hey, sorry, you can't go. And that employee is probably going to start looking for new jobs because that's their child. And a good parent is always going to choose their child over their job. So you want to prevent that. That is a tried and true example of a work-family conflict. So what do? The option is let them go at 3:15 and everybody else works until 4. Or you have to find some other kind of compromise. I'm not exactly sure. My solution would be to say, hey, on these days, you go get your kid. Don't worry about it. And then, it does in turn potentially create an internal conflict because then other employees are saying, hey, like, they get to leave 45 minutes early. Like, why don't I get to leave early? And it is kind of one of those things that you do have to understand the ramifications of your decisions. I do think that, like, one decision, it can lead to a lot. It can affect a lot. And I think the reality is that if, one of the most important traits in management, in leadership, is that the people that you are leading or managing, that they know that you intend for their best good, as much as you're able to. And so in situations like that, then some people might be grumpy about that. Oh, this person gets to leave 45 minutes early, and you have to deal with that. And the way you can deal with that is when this person has an issue, you work with them. You're flexible with them. It's not just a one-time why does Alice get to leave 45 minutes early, but I came back from my lunch break 10 minutes late and I'm getting written up? You know what I mean? So it's like there has to be some kind of flexibility. Obviously, it's a different situation if somebody's late rather than like an expected like early checkout. But I think you understand what I'm getting at is that the best way, in my experience as a manager and as an employee, is that the best way to avoid or to reduce and deal with work family conflict is to just be a real person. Understand that we all have things. Be flexible with your employees. When you're flexible with them, a lot of times they're flexible with you. Next question is, imagine you've been asked to develop a performance assessment program for employee development. What techniques could you use to adequately evaluate employee performance as comprehensively as possible? And then there's an example of using Murphy's List, which I will use in my answer. So let's see. Employee evaluation is an important topic. We're always going to face that. Well, we need to. If we're running an efficient business, we're always going to be evaluating things. You have to. And we want to be able to put data to the things that we believe. Data is so important. One of my professors has always said, all throughout my master's program, is that there's two types of people who run the world, and that is people with money and people with data. And he always says, and the people with data are beginning to overtake the people with money. Which I'm not exactly sure if that's true or not, but he always says it because he's one of the people with data. So I always take this from a two-pronged approach. As I've been a manager in my experience, what I've done is that I always try to place myself in situations in which I'm able to work with the person that I am assessing. You know, we can do surveys, we can do skills tests, and I think that those things have a place. But the best way for me to know and evaluate someone is to just be in the thick of it with them. So not only then am I able to evaluate them, I'm also able to build camaraderie with them. And that's just as important. That's like a little just side effect, a little byproduct of the evaluation is that, you know, a lot of people feel stressed out when they're being evaluated. But in this case, I can put myself in the foxhole with them and build rapport. And I think that that's really important. Beyond that, another way that's kind of like going into that is to ask the people who regularly work with them what it's like. And you can come up with a metric for that. So, like, you can have some kind of survey that you just ask them. You say, hey, so we have, we have Carson. Carson over here, he, how does he do with this? How does he do with this? What does this look like? How's the attitude? How's the punctuality? All those things, whatever it is that you're wanting to assess. And you can ask the people who are working with them because they are going to give you the best information on that person. And I think what's important, and as I mentioned in the previous question, I think it relates to this one, is that when your employees believe that your intentions are for their best good and for their flourishing, this is when we can all work together and do well in these areas. Because if your employees think that you're trying to get someone else in trouble, then they're not going to give you honest feedback on how the person is doing. But if they are just like, you know what? This Josh cares about us. Josh cares about this person. He wants us to do well. Okay, yeah, I have noticed, this, but I've also noticed this. And you're going to get like a range of good and bad. And I think that that's really important. So looking into Murphy's model of job performance, what he had discussed, and I do want to say really quickly, this model was made in 1994. I do believe that that's just a smidge outdated. I mean, that's 30 years now. And I do think it's a little outdated, but the idea is pretty good still. So I wanted to include it in this. So he talks about the way to assess the employees. It's very holistic, which I think is important. So in-role task oriented, which is at work, on the job, what you're supposed to be doing. How are people doing with that? Out of role, interpersonal tasks. And so, like, that means, like, how did you interact with your coworkers? How did you interact with the customers? How did you interact with X, Y, and Z? It's, like, just interpersonal stuff. Like, were you pleasant to talk to at the water cooler? And then downtime, so that's what you do outside of work. Like, how is that affecting you at work? And then destructive or hazardous behaviors. And it's like, well, is there anything that you're doing that's, like, problematic or causing trouble? And you just assess them as a whole based on those things, which I think is really important. And so you can include that as you're spending time with them, as you're talking to the people around them. So yeah, we just have to make sure that they understand it's intended for their good, and I think that that is the best case scenario. So let's see. Next and last question. What are some possible organizational constraints? How could they lead to counterproductive behaviors? So I think it's important. I just want to list what the textbook talks about and what they call organizational constraints. Um, and that would be information that you need for the job, money or resources to do the job, support from leadership or other employees to do the job, time to accomplish tasks, um, being prepared, whether that's people around you being prepared, whether that's you being prepared, whether that's people preparing you, um, availability. So, like, maybe you're not able to. Maybe you got scheduled for a meeting all day on a day that your boss comes in and says, hey, you need to have this project due by tonight. It's like, well, I'm in meetings all day. You're not available to do it. The work environment. Are people goofing around and having too much fun when you need to dial in? You know, that's all important. Scheduling. Maybe you don't have the people around you that you need around you at the time. Transportation. Maybe you need to get somewhere. Maybe you normally ride the bus, but you need to get to a meeting and you don't have a car. What are you gonna do? So that, or you finally, I thought this one was most intriguing, is authority. Maybe you need to lead a meeting and nobody takes you seriously because you're the new guy. And so all of these would be considered organizational strains or constraints because they relate back to the organization doing what it's supposed to for you. So way that these were listed in the text, they could be listed as 3 different ways if they're going to be a constraint, and that was as unavailable, inadequate, or poor quality. So I thought of an example, and so I'm, in management, manager at Starbucks, and I thought of an employee. What if they've been given poor information on how to make a specific drink? Someone orders the drink and they're there, that's their job, that's their position. What are their options there? If they're given poor quality information, inadequate information, and it's not available to them to get more or to be able to ask questions, what are they going to do? First of all, they could pause. They could say, all right, hey, I'm going to get to this. Want to make sure I do it right, and then go ask a more tenured employee. That's something you can do. That's often what I did in the beginning. And I think it just depends on the person. Some people want to do the best job that they can do, and so organizational constraints doesn't matter to them. They're going to make the best of it that they can do no matter what. But that's not often the case, and I haven't seen that to be true in many of the employees that I have worked with over my years there. So a lot of times what you might see is that they become frustrated, and often what happens is that if you have a drink, following in the example, Starbucks drink, they just might put what they think goes in there. They might just say, hey, I have no idea. I'm in a stressful situation. I haven't been prepared correctly for this. So I'm just frustrated. I don't know. I'm going to just toss this syrup in there. I hope it's right. And they just go on with their day. And that could, cause trouble. That could cause issues with your workflow if you have to remake the drink. That could cause issues with an employee. Someone might be mad because they know that that's not right. Then you might have to remake it. Or, they might not come back to your store anymore after that. I saw that a lot. And maybe someone's mad and they're like, you know what? This organization doesn't care about me, so I'm not going to care about them. And then the problem is when it begins to spill out into other aspects of the job. So, like, this organization doesn't care about me. Okay, well, yeah, I'm not going to make this drink right because I don't know how. And you know what? This next drink, I do know how to make it right. And I'm going to do it wrong because I'm mad at this organization. And that's worst case scenario. That is never what you want to see. But it happens. I've seen it happen. I have had conversations with people who I knew that this was happening with in my role. And the truth is that we have to equip our people to do their jobs. And if we're not equipping them, if we're not giving them the resources that they need, then it's just no good. And we're putting ourselves in these counterproductive situations that can lead to malicious behavior or just burnout or lack of empathy or, it's all these things. It can lead to worse things. Not equipping our employees, it does nothing except lead our people into worse places. It breaks their trust and it's just no good. So that's what I think for that one. So that is all the questions. Yeah, so that's all. Thanks so much. Hope you have a good rest of your day.